that's why Senna was amazing in those days, because you needed to second guess where the grip would be on the way into a corner, react quickly, and carry the speed. But it was just nuts. 1200. I thought the 80s was a wonderful period to drive Formula One cars. I was very lucky. Of course, I think whichever era you were driving in, you'll probably have a special feeling towards or expect that could have been the best time. I mean, imagine being in the 50s and 60s. I mean, it was much more dangerous then, and you were almost certainly going to have some deaths through a season, and maybe guaranteed on a weekend. And sometimes two drivers died in a weekend back in those decades. But the 80s, the cars were fearsome. They were really physical to drive. No power steering and manual shift, a lot of that for most of the cars. And the suspension and what have you wasn't really that finely developed, so the cars jumped around a lot, flew off curbs. And part of your job was to keep the car on the track, really, most of the lap. And if you arrived into a corner in the right gear, pointing in the right direction, carrying a nice bit of speed through the apex, that was kind of a win on that corner. Now, if the drivers brake a metre too early, then that's a fail to an extent. So the tolerances have moved dramatically. The drivers of today are much more precise. We didn't have the ability to be that precise because the cars were so physical. And you'll imagine video footage of Senna bouncing around Monaco and the cars really moving around a lot. So it was very exciting. We had turbocharged engines, of course. So Saturday morning, you'd do final practice with 800 horsepower, get back in it, the same car 2 hours later with 1250 horsepower. And a set of qualifying tyres that was good for about 3/4 of a lap. So you would creep out of the pits, trying not to fire the tyres up, trying not to get in Senna's way or anybody else's way who were on a flying lap. And then the last couple of corners, build it up a little bit and let the car go into the pit straight. That pinned you to the back. I mean, the accelerators, somewhere like Monaco, where you're going over Massenet into Casino Square with full turbo boost because they've closed the wastegates and you're getting everything. I mean, the power did that through the lap because everything started to heat up too much. But luckily, it kind of sort of matched the way the tyres were falling apart as well. So the first few corners, you wouldn't have much front end grip because, sure, you can fire the rear tyres up with all of that power. But you crept around the outlap, so the front's not really working. Then they come in and the backs are good. So the middle half of the lap, really everything's hooked up. The sticky tyres are working, the engine's pushing, and it's really exciting. And then towards the end of the lap, your rear tyres are going off. So you're now jockeying it around, trying to be a little bit careful on the downshifts and not snatching upshift either because you just light the rear tyres up. I mean, I had in Adelaide once, doing whatever 180 miles an hour, spun the rear wheels up because there just wasn't quite enough grip with that sort of power. So you really had two cars in one, the quali car and then the race car. The weird thing was actually on a Saturday morning with a soft set of tyres, when you're really in the groove with just clicking the boost up a couple of clicks on the Renault Turbo, for example, you could do a time nearly as fast as the full boost qualifying lap where you had to jockey so many things. And that's why Senna was amazing in those days, because you needed to second guess where the grip would be on the way into a corner, react quickly and carry the speed. But it was just nuts. 1250, 1300 horsepower in a car of that weight. But the other problem we had, though, is you needed to protect your car, your tyres, your brakes, your drive shafts, your gearbox dog rings, your engines, everything. So if you got to the end of the race, it was almost a surprise back in those days. And if you were running 10th at half distance and you finished, you would almost certainly be in the points in the top 6 back in those days. If you were running top 6 at half distance, you'd probably be on the podium if you finished. Unreliability was such a key element back then. And we talk about how racing used to be better then. I don't think it was, if I'm honest, because the cars were so fragile. And you could be on the podium in, let's say, third place, 2 laps behind the winner. I mean, how crazy is that? Imagine that in today's world. So in a way, I think they were dramatic. The cars were quite different, and we really had to manhandle the cars. And if we got it wrong, it hurt a lot. So they were good, but I would absolutely choose today's cars over those cars. I think back in those earlier decades of Formula One, which is now over 70 years old, the rate of development was probably higher because the rules weren't so tight, and somebody could come along with skirts and, on the ground effect cars, or some kind of clever suspension system, or a fan car, or a double chassis car, or whatever. I think there was so much more scope then to think outside of the box, and very much outside of the regulations, to come up with something dramatically new, or different tyres, for example, or an aero concept. So I think it sort of, everything was feeling like it was coming on in leaps and bounds, whereas now it necessarily has to be much more tied down. But of course, the cars today are like Swiss watches. They're masterpieces of engineering. We would spend our life for a decade in engineering meetings trying to make F1 cars handle better, go faster, and with the tools they have even on the steering wheel now to adjust the differential or the power delivery, would be more effective than we could achieve in a year, for example, in terms of, you could keep changing the ramps in the diff, or you could fundamentally change the suspension geometry, and struggle to really make an impact on the actual potential of your F1 car. So in a way it was rudimentary, but in a way it was also exciting, because there was so much scope to gain a big advantage. And you could put a rear wing on and find a second and a half a lap. Now, if you find 2/10, it's dramatic.